So today it's really all about the skull. We are starting what is about 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, I think about 4 weeks, dedicated to going through every layer of the human body as it relates to the face in a way. So today we're really starting with like the base, which is the skull. Next week we'll be talking about the facial muscles, and the week after that we'll be covering facial fat pads, which is perhaps the crazier one of the three. Our goal is really to concentrate ourselves on artistic anatomy, which means that we will be looking at everything that is important for you guys to understand from an artistic standpoint. So everything that relates to any kind of bump that you could imagine on the surface of the skin. We will be talking about that, but things that happen deeper within the face that don't really have any sort of implication as far as facial bumps and volumes and shape is concerned. We'll have a tendency to talk about these things a bit less. I'll certainly point out some things here and there, but for the most part, these anatomy classes are really concentrated on what is effective for you to know if you want to be sculpting faces or drawing faces or doing anything else like that. But if you do want to join us for the recording itself, and if you want to ask any sort of Q&A questions, since we have two Q&A blocks that we do every week, you're free to join us on Discord. And we are pretty much recording this every Saturday at noon, straight on Discord. You need to have the subscriber role that has been given to you previously. But if that's the case, if you have that, if you're completely set up and you want to join us live, you want to chat, you want to ask questions, or just interrupt me while I'm streaming, you can certainly do so by joining us on Discord directly. So today it's all about the skull. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I think that's better. So today we'll be talking about the features, of course, but I really don't want this to turn into just me enumerating a bunch of different features and then giving you guys a bunch of pictures to go and just be like, okay, like now this is your problem. Now you have to go and kind of understand this yourself, you know? I really want to make sure that we really break down everything that has to do with shape. I really want us to concentrate ourselves very, very precisely as it relates to shapes and really talk about the shapes of these different features as it relates to the surface of the skin. What we can see, what we can perceive while we are, and what certainly we should represent when we are sculpting faces there. So today, from now until the first Q&A, so which will be at about an hour or so from now, a bit longer than that, we'll be talking first about a somewhat general pass on just the skull itself, just to look at it and see what we can already observe that is kind of interesting to talk about. And beyond that, then we'll start breaking it down really feature by feature. Most of what we'll be talking about before the Q&A, the first one will be related to the top part of the skull, so mostly the frontal bone and everything that is related to that. There's quite a lot to talk about. That is probably the most prominent skull feature, if you will, because everywhere else around the face, there's a nice layer of muscles and fat on top of the skull, but everything that is on top of the skull is actually very, very thin. So there's a lot to talk about there. And there's some really, really key differences there between males and females that is also worth to break down. So we'll be speaking about that for quite a while. And then after we're done with that, we'll take a break and we will move on to the second part of the class today, more or less just looking at the impact of the skull on facial anatomy from the mid-face and for the jaw itself. And after the break, we will conclude today's class by talking about differences between a young skull or the skull of a young person and the skull of an older person. We'll do a bit of a breakdown for that. I have some references to share to you guys. I also have prepared a bunch of images as handouts, so you guys can already go ahead and download the handout files from outgang.studio for today's class. And what is in the handout for today? There is essentially a bunch of images. Let me bring this down here. So as I said, I've bought a bunch of scans of skulls, of faces. There's a whole lot of stuff to go through. And what I did is that I've pretty much done a color coding, if you will, for the different major bones of the face here. And I did some nice little renders using Marmoset 4 so that you guys can appreciate just better renders than what you would have if you were to just send this straight into ZBrush. All of the different bones that constitute the skull. and the shape of them and stuff. So I'll be pointing out, of course, a lot of these during the class today, and this is there more or less as a kind of reminder. So if you don't have the money to buy these scans, they are very useful. These are straight from 3D Scan Store. I guess I can already show you guys where they are. It's really nothing all that complicated. They're not very expensive if you don't buy commercial licenses, which I have to do, of course, which is why I've spent money so that you guys don't have to spend cash. That's more or less how it goes there. So let's see here. So this is a 3D Scan Store. They have these really beautiful scans. I mean, I highly recommend that you guys do buy them if you are interested by them. I also don't get a cut of that. There's no affiliation here. It's just, I just think that they're actually very, very good. They're not super expensive. You know, these are, what, 15 sterling pounds or so? And they're just absolutely beautiful references to take a look at. It really, really makes a huge difference if you can, like, look at an actual 3D skull and really kind of, like, as opposed to just look at like 2D pictures. Because the problem with like 2D pictures, right? If you're like, okay, like let's say that we take, I don't know, like some random bone of the face. Let's look at, let's say, temporal bone. Let's just look for the temporal bone, right? Let's say that we're looking at like pictures, right? Like if all we do is look at these 2D pictures, it's actually quite hard to appreciate the depth of everything that we are looking at, right? Like if we take a look at this picture right here, it's hard to kind of appreciate, like, let's say the different depth, the subtleties and the different plane changes that happen on the skull. And so when you start to look at like actual 3D references, especially if they have like a nice lighting on top of them, you can start to really appreciate a lot more the shapes. Here's the widest point of the head right here, you know, the parietal eminences, which we have talked about a little bit last week. You can already appreciate a lot more some of the subtleties inherent in the anatomy itself. So yeah, particularly like these ones, by the way. If we take a look at this one, like especially this one here, actually. Anyone who's studied anatomy a little bit knows that there is essentially a muscle right here that is called temporalis, which we will talk more in detail next week. But if you just look at 2D pictures, it's hard to appreciate just how incredibly thick this muscle gets and how much what we call the temporal fossa, so the kind of cavity on the skull that the temporalis fits into. It's hard to appreciate how deep that thing and how deep that actual fossa is. But once you start looking at like 3D references, like you can easily fit a finger through there, you know? You could easily fit a finger through that hole in the skull right behind the zygomatic bone there. So looking at 3D references like really like helps a lot to really appreciate the depth of these different things. So all of these images, like you can see that there's a lot of different views. There are male and female ones as well. Let me actually just bring this down. This is a whole Photoshop document. There you go. Yeah, so you have images of the full male and female skulls, and they all have been color-coded, and I have gone in there and I have made sure to select, in all cases, angles that I think are really good to have, you know? Like, we don't often take a look at, let's say, the skull from this kind of angle here, or like this one here, you know, like we don't always kind of look at that when we're looking at like references of people, especially for sculpting from like a bunch of different references of like a random person that we decide to sculpt and that we find online somewhere. You know, like we often do these likeness studies, right? We all like to kind of do that of like these famous people. You can't really get views from this kind of angle, or at least it's very hard to do so. You can if you look at references. If you find references of, let's say, TV shows or movies, you have a better chance of getting angles like these that are very interesting on the face that are not often seen. But it's hard to do so. So if you don't have access to these kind of really interesting references for your own, for the person that you are doing, at the very least, you can have these images of the skull to really kind of have an idea of what the skull looks like from these not often studied yet highly important angles on the face. Yeah, so I've spent a bunch of cash on this so that you guys don't have to. Yeah, so that's it. I hope that these are very useful. These are the handout for this week. As I said, I've also bought a whole lot of different actual scans, as you guys can see, so that we can really not only look at the skull, look at pictures of the skull and really talk about the anatomy of it, but I really also want today to really look at what these different features of the skull really look like if we look at someone at an actual real face, you know? And if you're going to do 3D art, if you're going to sculpt faces, like I consider that like actual 3D scans are probably the best reference you can ever find for like how does the face actually look, so to speak, you know? Like it's really, really hard to judge depth and angles when we just look at pictures of like references. Personally speaking, like looking at actual 3D scans and really sort of looking at them from like every different angle, really kind of trying to really understand the different bumps, the subtleties, and the plane changes of the face. There's really nothing more valuable than doing that using an actual 3D scan, as opposed to just random pictures that we can find online there. Okay, so let's get started then. So let's start with a few insights before we really start to delve deep into the different bones of the face and the smaller features. Let's just start with a few insights that we can kind of glean just by looking at skulls like these. So I don't want to enumerate. I really want to use our time effectively to really transmit as much of the subtleties and kind of information that would be hard to transmit otherwise to you guys today. So as far as the bones are concerned, we won't necessarily spend time to go through and name each bone that we have on the skull. It's very easy to find that information online. The reference, the handout that I'm giving you guys also has that information in there. So I don't want to go in here and start to name things because we'll do that essentially more or less organically throughout the time that we have today. But what I do want to point out that is good to point out already is simply the fact that the skull is composed of a bunch of different bones. There are quite a lot of different bones in the skull itself. Some are very small, some are very big. And they're all separated by what we call sutures, since they all kind of more or less get fused together at some point in life there. In fact, when we are born, when we are born, a lot of our sutures between the different bones of the skull are not actually welded yet, and they sort of ossify throughout life. Some ossify very early in life, some do so a bit later. But the idea there is that like the skull is composed of all these different bones. They're more or less flexible kind of joints between the different bones. When we are born, which helps for a lot of things, one is simply to get through the birth canal. The way that these different bones merge together and sort of ossify through time, they really start to create these really, really wildly different shapes to the skull itself. And this will become very apparent to you guys once we start to go through these different references that we have. In fact, let's jump ahead to ZBrush and we can already start to look at that together. You know, like there is quite a lot of variation as to how the different bones of the skull really connect. And a lot of them don't necessarily connect at a fully flat angle there. In fact, there's a lot of variability when it comes to that, you know, and this will become actually very, very obvious here in just a second. So pretty much all the sutures that we have, they're all in the same location on pretty much every head. So, and as I said, the angles between them are not always necessarily completely flat, you know. So this is a female skull, by the way. You can see here I have two skulls. I have a male one and a female one. And if we take a look at the male one, so from this particular, on this particular skull, if we take a look at the top here, right here, if we take a look at this particular suture here, which we call the sagittal one, this one here. So on the male skull, you guys can see that it's pretty flat. Like the two bones, they really meet in a way that is fully flat there. Although it's not flat all the way throughout, you know, like if we look at this particular suture, let's say from this angle here, you can see that on the back, it's still flat, but it almost starts to cave in a little bit. Like it's very, very light, right? But it does start to cave in a little bit. Whereas in like other cases here, and this is very beautifully displayed on the female skull. If you take a look at the female skull instead, and we take a look at the sagittal suture, now suddenly it's actually creating a bit of a point. They're not actually meeting at the same angle as what we had on the male skull. There's a lot of variability like that happens, you know. There is also a suture here that separates the nasal bone from the frontal bones. There's one right here, and it's pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's very obvious simply looking at it that the two bones, the frontal bone, which is the bone right here on the top, and the nasal bones, that they really don't meet, that there's a bit of an angle break that simply happens there between the bones. The skull, especially like the whole box here of the skull, it simply doesn't have a round appearance, really. You know, like if we've never really like studied the actual shape of the skull, you know, like the whole bony structure that we have around the brain there, if we've never really actually studied the shape of this, we have a tendency to sculpt it as a way that more or less looks like a sphere like this, you know, like we like kind of often hear that, you know, if you want to sculpt the head, you should start with a sphere, you should chop off the sides, you should extend this down to make the mandible and stuff, you know, and it's a very, very good starting point to do that. But as long as we don't forget to come back on the whole ball of the skull here, if you will, to really start to really make it look a lot more anatomically correct or more appealing, I suppose, you know. There's a lot of variability here. So here's the male skull again. And if we take a look at this actual suture here that separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones, you can see the same thing again. See here how this suture is not actually like even though the bone here like seems to be relatively flat and the bone here seems to be relatively flat, and we could almost kind of draw a straight line from here to there, there's still a bump here, you know, like you guys can see that the shape of the bones is very, very organic, for lack of a better term. And there's this kind of bump here that simply happens at the suture. And we don't have this bump on like every head. Sometimes it's even the opposite, you know. If we take a look at the female skull again, you know, if we take a look at the female skull, it's not a bump now. It's actually something that recedes in. There's no rule as far as any of this is actually concerned. You will find any kind of variation on these themes out in the wild. These change tremendously from person to person. So the best we can do really is simply observe a bunch of skulls and kind of build for ourselves a bit of a mental library of what these different shapes look like. Yeah, so here we can beautifully see here we have the sagittal suture right here. This is actually the back of the skull, so this would be the occipital bone. And it kind of, you know, we have this kind of Y-shaped sort of suture there. So all of that is very, very visible on the surface of the skull, and certainly on the surface of the skin as well. For example, right here, right? If you take a look at this head right here, we can easily still see the separation there between, there's one suture here and there's one suture going all the way down here, yeah? So we can see the shape of this kind of valley that kind of gets created on this particular head. From side view, so we have the same suture here. And in this case, we can see that there's this kind of bump here on the front, and then there's a bump here on the back. You know, but in certain cases, this will look a bit more like this. So it's good to really try and study that, if you can, on your references. Now, it helps to obviously have references that are very, that don't have hair, you know, like it kind of helps to read these things a bit better there. But, you know, if you do have a reference of someone that has hair, there's really nothing that stops you from grabbing pictures of someone else who you can see the skull and really create the skull based on someone else's pictures. At the very least, you will get something that will be more anatomically pleasing than if you simply leave this as simply one big round sphere. Here is Patrick Stewart. Very interesting guy, right? Like, the shape of his skull is like one that is kind of endlessly fascinating. You can see the point again right here that happens right there, as the parietal bones meet in the middle and create the sagittal suture. Here he is from profile view. I'm sure you guys have all seen this before and kind of wonder like, what's going on, you know? Like, why is this like this? Well, it's like that simply because of the sutures and the fact that the bones do not meet at a right angle, or at a flat angle in most cases. So there's a lot of complexity to the different planes of the skull then. So here are the parietal eminences that we have seen and we have talked about a little bit last week. Let's go through these different skulls and see what it kind of looks like. Pretty much all the female scans that I have here, they all have hair. So obviously this will make it a bit harder to read what is under there. But at the very least, we can certainly appreciate that, you know, some of this volume here is actually created by the hair there. So obviously we should not assume that that is simply the shape of the skull there. But we can still appreciate how the top part of the skull is very relatively flat, you know, like it's mostly flat. you know, there's a flatness here on the top, you know? So you get something flat here, flat there, and then more or less flat here, you know? Like we kind of have like 3 or 4 major planes, if you will, for the shape of the skull. We more or less often have something that kind of looks like this here, or sometimes it's more like 1, 2, 3, 4, you know? So the shape of this will change on person to person, but what I really want you guys to really appreciate at this point is really the fact that the skull really is a combination of straight segments, if you will, and that we have these sharp angles in different places that sometimes aligns itself with the sutures and sometimes it does not. But the only thing that is important to know is that it is not completely, fully spherical or circular. There is a lot of variation there. From the side, actually, we've talked about last week a little bit about the parietal eminences, the little bump that we have here, which constitute the widest point of the cranium. And well, sometimes it's a bit lower than that, but this point right here, essentially, you guys can clearly see that there is an angle change that kind of happens there. And it happens both on the female skull and on the male skull. So from here, you know, like we have this relatively flat section here, which is created by the parietal bone. And then as we reach the point of attachment of the temporal muscle on the bone, we more or less have a very sharp transition down to a side plane for the skull there, you know? So here too, like this will sometimes look like a point, sometimes it won't look like a point. Sometimes this will be flatter, but in almost all cases, we can really appreciate a flat side to the skull and then more or less a flat top to the skull. And then there is a lot of angle change that is happening right here at the parietal eminence. Of course, hair will soften that. And yeah, look at this depression here. All this kind of depression here, which is once again happening because of the suture that separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. So yeah, there's a lot of variability. So flat here, relatively flat there. There's a lot of variability that happens. So, I mean, beyond that, we can't really draw conclusions that would be true across the board. There's a lot of variability to the shape of the skull. But as long as as you start to really observe that for yourself and you really start to pay attention to the different bumps, where the different sutures are, where the different plane changes are when looking at your own references, you'll be able to do a pretty good job in the future. And you know, the great thing about this too is that no one will look at your skull and probably think that you haven't sculpted the exact skull of whoever it is that you are sculpting as a likeness, unless you do. You are creating Patrick Stewart's head, because there's so much variability that, you know, it's like, yeah, as long as it kind of looks like a skull, I mean, it's going to be convincing, right? Let's look next at surface details a little bit. If we take a look at a skull as well, certainly anything that's been 3D scanned or like real life bones and stuff, there's some really interesting things that happen on the surface, and we can really deduce quite a few things from that. All the muscles that we have, like, they leave an imprint on whichever bone that they are connected to in 2 different ways. One is that where the muscles turn to a tendon and where the tendon connects to the bone there, the surface of the skull, and certainly of any bone, really start to get a very porous appearance to it. So when you're looking at a reference of a skull or of any bone really, and you can really see that sort of very high porosity on the surface, it's a good sign that there's probably a muscle that connects there. So I really find this fascinating. On these skulls here, especially since they've been 3D scanned, you won't be able to get this if all you look at is pictures of like drawn pictures of skulls and stuff like that. You're not going to get these kind of subtleties here. Like, you guys can see here, so this is what we call the angle of the mandible. So the mandible being, of course, the whole bony structure of the jaw there. And what we call this here, so this is the angle of the mandible. And you guys can see here, see how bumpy the corner of the mandible is? You can see, like, even on the female skull, there's less of it, but we can still appreciate that this is a lot bumpier than what we have elsewhere on the face there, or on the skull itself. And every time that you see these kind of bumps, it's a good sign that this is simply an attachment point for a tendon, which can actually help to understand where some of the muscles originate or where they connect and how wide they are and stuff like that. But like even beyond that, like one thing that I find really crazy about this particular skull and that I think is beautiful and is something that I had not observed until I observed it here first, is the fact that we can even see the actual trace of the muscles themselves, you know? So like you guys can see that there's kind of like a bit of a like two kind of valleys that are sort of running right next to each other here, right there. And it's actually the first time that I can observe this on an actual skull. And these things here are actually the imprint left on the bone from the muscle that we call the masseter, which we'll speak more next week. But you can really appreciate the whole shape of the masseter right here simply by looking at the trace that is left on the surface. Here's an anatomical reference of what the masseter looks like. So it looks like this, right? And we start from the side here of the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone, and we simply like go and we connect down to the angle of the mandible there. And yeah, like you can see the kind of like the structure of the masseter, how it's kind of these little sections, you know, of like muscle right there, and you can individually see their imprint on the surface of the skull. This is really beautiful to see. And finally, the last little insight I want to share before we really start to delve deep into the features there is simply the fact that there is quite a lot of asymmetry, really. A lot more asymmetry on the skull than what we have a tendency to sculpt, you know? And I mean, I'm responsible of this. Like, I do this as much as anyone else does, really. Like, when I'm sculpting in ZBrush, I have a tendency to simply sculpt with symmetry on, and, you know, you kind of get a bit lazy about it, and you sort of sculpt the whole face, you know, and maybe at the end you'll break the symmetry by turning off symmetry after you're almost done with the face, and then you'll just maybe shift a few features around, you know? And it certainly helps to break the symmetry, but at the same time, it's not naturalistic to do something like that, you know? Like if we look at like any of these two skulls, really, like the moment that we kind of start to rotate the camera, let's say that I rotate the camera like this, right? The moment that we start to like rotate the camera, we can see how like everything is just slightly asymmetrical. It's like the shape of the nose here, you can see that it's slightly larger on like one side. The nose is not perfectly symmetrical. If we look at the nose in relation to what we call the superciliary arches right here, you can see that this one sticks out just a bit more than like this one here. Everything is just slightly asymmetrical. I'm thinking that maybe I need to rotate this by 1 degree. Just give me a second. Yeah, like that. That's probably gonna help. Definitely rotate it slightly. But see, like, this is the thing. It's like, if I try to rotate this so that the front of the face is on the same plane, now suddenly the back of the skull is now shifted to like one side, you know? And on the female one as well, you know, like if we simply take a look here, like, you know, there's this kind of like, almost a whole skull is almost kind of like slanted in one direction a little bit, right? There's a lot of asymmetry here. And, you know, when we are sculpting, we often have a tendency to make that a lot less than what it actually would be in real life there. So yeah, like it's nice to kind of appreciate that, you know, and really take a look at what that actually looks like. So, okay, what we're going to do is that we're pretty much going to go through every important facial feature that you need to know to be able to properly sculpt faces. There is a lot of different features. If you open anatomy books, you will realize that, you know, like, especially if the anatomy book is not of an artistic angle, if you simply look at a medical book, it's easy to get drowned in lots of different names left and right. You know, like we've certainly talked about a few of them last week, 2 weeks ago, when we had our last class. We certainly talked about a few of them in the context of bony landmarks, you know, to do anthropometry and these sorts of things. We'll be looking at a few of those today. But as I said, my goal is not to do an exhaustive enumeration of every facial feature. I want to concentrate ourselves on the important ones that you need to know to properly sculpt faces there. So we'll be filtering information and really kind of trying to understand the important ones. But so the first one that I want to propose as a extremely important feature for you to know to really be able to sculpt a skull properly is what we call the superciliary arches. So superciliary arch, you can see on this anatomical reference that there's kind of a shape. It's kind of hard to tell what kind of shape it is. From this one here, it looks like an oval. And this one here kind of looks like an oval too. Now, they are at the proper location on the frontal bone. So this is a good starting point as a reference, but we really need to break it down and really look at the superciliary arches more than that to really understand exactly the kind of shape that they have. The first thing that you will notice about the superciliary arches is that there are significant gender differences when it comes to the shape of those. Now, nothing of what we will say today should constitute a rule when it comes to sculpting faces or representing the different facial features. We all more or less exist. We all fully exist. If you more or less exist on the spectrum, you may be an alien. But we all fully exist right on the spectrum going from female to male sort of thing. And what we find is that every facial feature you can imagine more or less is a bit of on that spectrum somewhere, you know? So everything we'll say today, like we will kind of define clear rules in a way as to what is more male and what is more female, but ultimately what you have to really realize is that when you're sculpting faces, when you're looking at references, that everyone is kind of like has a bit of a mix of these different features to different intensities, you know? None of what I will say constitutes in any way a kind of rule as it comes to what facial anatomy should be or what it should look like. It's simply a guide as to perhaps what to pay more attention to in certain cases. And if you are sculpting a male or female face, perhaps what to try and perhaps pay attention to capture it properly so that your face will indeed read as what you expect it to. So the first thing that we notice about the superciliary arches is that they are a lot more prominent on males than they are on females. So we've defined the superciliary arches as this kind of bump right here. See how huge it is right now. This bump here, so this is the male skull, and you guys can see how huge this actual bump is right now. And so this is on the male skull. This is what the superciliary arches look from profile on a female skull. It looks like this. See the differences there? Male, female, male, female. We still have on the female skull, we still have a certain bump there for the superciliary arches. They are simply reduced in intensity there. But there are female skulls where you will have a feeling that the skull is fully flat and that you simply cannot see them at all. That certainly happens, although it should go without saying at this point that also happens for males in certain cases, but a lot less. So a lot of people define the superciliary arches as having more or less a bit of a bean shape to it. Let's look here. So they more or less have a bit of a bean shape to them, you know, like, or a kidney bean shape, in the sense that you can see that it's not just this here, although that is perhaps the most prominent part of it, but there's often a bit of a continuation here towards the bottom, towards the inside, towards the medial part of the skull there. There's a bit of the bump kind of continues down here a little bit. So you get this kind of kidney bean shape. And what's also interesting that is really beautiful to see in these different skulls, not only does it have a kidney bean shape, but you can also appreciate how, I guess I could just keep this for now. You can also appreciate how there almost seems to be a sharp transition here. You know, there almost seems to be two planes to it, like a top plane and then a bottom plane. And depending on the skull, this will be either more or less prominent, that kind of planar angle that we have here, but there are certainly a lot of cases where that plane is very visible, you know? So we have a kidney bean shape that starts on the bottom and medial part of the frontal bone, and it really extends out diagonally towards the top. So this is the male skull again, and we can clearly clearly appreciate the two planes to it, right? We have the top plane and we have the bottom plane. Look at how nice and sharp that actual transition is. On the female skull, the superciliary arches are there a little bit. As I rotate the light around, you guys can see that we certainly still have them. They're just way, way more subtle. We can still kind of see a bit of a top part and a bit of a bottom part though, right? It's like that separation here between the top plane and the bottom plane is still kind of visible. And superciliary arches certainly are still there, but they are a lot less prominent. So let's go through a few of these different scans and really kind of see what these things look like. See, like, this is the thing that kind of happens that is really, really beautiful to take a look at. Often you will see this kind of plane here, right? You can see here this kind of plane that is diagonally pointing down. We can see this kind of angle change. Let me take a screenshot of this. This is really, really beautiful to take a look at. And let me just paste this here. Yeah, so you can see there's this line here. It's kind of here on this angle. Harder to see because of the light, but it's kind of here, right? So we have this plane here. You know, that's kind of pointing down in this kind of direction there. And because these things are angled, the bottom border of the superciliary arch isn't straight like this, is not vertical, it's kind of angled here. And we can really clearly see this line here. You know, we can really see it on both sides. And then there's the top part here. She has superciliary arches that are a bit more prominent. And this is also very interesting. See how the eyebrows themselves, you know, we have a tendency to do eyebrows when we do 3D models. We sometimes have a tendency to do eyebrows in a way that are like this. They're kind of pointing in this direction a little bit. You know, we kind of have a tendency to like sculpt this as something that is somewhat round, and then we kind of put the eyebrow here. You know, we have a tendency to kind of sculpt like that. Whereas what we should be doing is something more like this, and then we should be putting the eyebrows on the plane that is facing downward. Here's a picture of Daniel Day-Lewis, which shows us very clearly just how angled the bottom plane of the superciliary arches can really be, and just how much towards the bottom the hair of the brow is actually pointing, you know? So yeah, keep that in mind, you know? Don't make this completely round, give it just a bit of a sharpness, and really try to capture that nice kind of kidney bean shape. See, same thing again, right here, same thing again right here. Now, her superciliary arches are actually really high, right? It's like we can actually kind of spot here the, more or less the transition here from top part to like bottom part here. Her eyebrows are actually very, very low right now in relation to that. Whereas for her here, she almost has none of them. Like the superciliary arches are very, very reduced. And now for the males. Yeah, take a look at this one here, right? See how big those superciliary arches are? These are like huge nuts. Can I make a nut joke? I'm not sure that's a good idea. So, bottom plane, top plane, and we have this huge shape like this. Yeah, so see this border here that separates all this kind of soft tissue that is right over the lids? Now, which is more or less flat like this. And then we have this, and then we have that, and then we have that. So these are all the different planes that we have created by the superciliary arches. Yeah, it's a hugely important gender differentiator. It's one of the, like I've read a few things on that. A lot of researchers say that like it is the one thing that separates, like if there is one feature that you should choose as the cranial feature, if you will, that separates males and females, the superciliary arches would be the most important one in terms of prominence. All right, so there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens around the orbit of the eye itself. Let's take a look at a few of those. So the orbit of the eye. First of all, there are also key gender differences there. And here are male and female skull pictures side by side, right? So if we take a look at, so this is female, of course, this is male. If we take a look at the shape of the orbit of the eye, right? So the opening here, so the opening of the eye, we can also notice that it is not fully circular, just like the skull is. There's a lot of variability here, and it is certainly not a circle, right? We have a top part here, we have a lateral wall here, a bottom here, and then we have a top one here. So we more or less get this kind of box shape. It's kind of rotated on the side. So we get these kind of boxes there. But the transitions do seem to be slightly smoother on the female skull than they are on the male skull. You know, like this arch here, this looks like it's just a bit rounder. The corners, they all look like they're just a bit rounder on the female skull. But at a minimum, yeah, we would start by defining like the most simple representation we can do for the orbit of the eye is a simple box like this that is slanted on the side. But beyond that, there is a lot more complexity to the shape of the orbit of the eye. And one particular thing I want to bring your attention to right now is what we call here the supraorbital notch. So we've defined the superciliary arches as being here, right? As we reach a point here, there is a point here that we call the suprasternal or supraorbital notch. And that separates the ridge here, the supraorbital ridge. So this is supraorbital ridge. Supra simply means over, so it is the thing that is on top of. So the supraorbital ridge gets separated at this point here at what we call the suprasternal notch. Let me write that down. Maybe that's not the best color. So this little point here. So we start by defining the shape of the orbit of the eye as a bit of a slanted box, but once we start to break it down further, let's say that we start getting into more the secondary planes, if you will, right? We start to realize that the top part of it kind of starts to create this this kind of pointy shape to it. And so this angle change is actually very, very visible, you know, which we can appreciate it once more, right? Like we have this line here, which is the bottom of the superciliary arches themselves. And we can really start to appreciate how the side here, the supraorbital ridge here on the side actually starts to slant down again. And we really get this kind of interplay. So we have here the superciliary arches on top, and then we reach a point here, which is a supraorbital notch. And then we have this part here on the side, which slants downward. And so that angle change is very, very visible on certain people if they don't have necessarily a lot of orbital fat and other things there. So here's a few examples of that. So here it is again, supraorbital notch. And here's from 3/4, you know, from here it's very, very easy to see, right? It's like you get this kind of trapezius shape like this, which would actually create a flat plane on the front, actually. If we were to look at simply the planes, our planes would actually look something like that. Then this would be like this, and then this would be like that, right? So supraorbital notch here and here. We have a very clear angle change happening to it. So here is Alicia Keys, and we have this trapezius shape right here, suprasternal notch, and we start to go down again. There is more than bone here. So we do have the supraorbital ridge right here, but we do have more than that. We also have fat that is on top of this, especially for females. This is actually a very, very fatty zone, if you will. So there is more there than simply bone. But certainly we can absolutely appreciate the downward slant here of the orbital ridge. This is also very interesting because although we have this downward slant for the orbital ridge, we still have this upward slant for the eyebrows themselves, right? So the eyebrows do not cleanly follow the shape of the orbital ridge. It actually kind of goes almost against that. So you should always kind of sculpt your heads first without having the eyebrows in there. And you should really get like all these little landmarks left and right first. And once you have that, then you should add the eyebrows on top and kind of make him more angled towards the top. And make sure that they don't cleanly follow the shape of the orbital ridge there. Because if you do, it's going to look a bit just not natural. Yeah, so here is Cillian Murphy. And I really like this guy because he's got a face that I just like to look at. You know, there's just something about his face. Like, there's like people like that, you know? Like, I think that's one of the great things about learning anatomy itself, and also like watching a lot of movies and stuff, is that you really start to you start to have these kind of people that you just can't stop looking at their faces. You're just endlessly fascinated by their faces, right? So like, for me, like, I think the person that I'm the most fascinated with, sure you all know that about me at this point, is Mads Mikkelsen. I love this guy's face, you know? I mean, he's fantastic as an actor as well, and he plays roles that I really, really like, you know? But I love to just spend hours just looking at his face. I mean, I've looked at it enough. It's time for me to move on from that guy. But like, you know, like he's just one of these people that I just find is endlessly fascinating to take a look at. So Cillian Murphy is one of those as well. There's just something about his face that I just really, really like to take a look at, right? And one of the things that's really interesting about his face is that he doesn't have a lot of orbital fat. So this whole zone here that is right above the upper lid of the eye itself, you will often see a lot of fat that kind of builds up in that particular zone. And that varies a lot from people to people, and we will absolutely come back on that topic once the time is right here. But one of the things that I find very fascinating about Cillian Murphy's face is that he really doesn't have any of that. It's like there's no fat here at all. I mean, he does technically have fat in there for sure, but because you need that to you know, be able to properly rotate the eye around and stuff, but there's none of it that's really visible here. And so you can also cleanly see where is the supraorbital notch, and you can really appreciate the downward slant of the supraorbital ridge. And, you know, this part here, which would be our superciliary arches. What's interesting about all of this, about the whole bone structure around the orbit of the eye, is that it creates some interesting shapes too from profile, you know? So from front view, it more or less looks like a box that's slanted on the side, but there's more complexity to it than that. And once we start to look at a face from profile and 3/4, we can see that from profile and 3/4, it doesn't look like a simple box, right? Like, it's not just a shape like this. There is more to it than that, you know? There is a very, like, somewhat sharp corner here that kind of happens. So we would have the supraesternal notch somewhere about here or so. And from here to here, you know, like, there is this very nice kind of shape that kind of builds up there. Like, if I was to build the major planes, right? Let's just disregard and sort of simplify the front here. What we have, something that looks like this. You know, if we just look at the very like primary shapes here, right? What do we have to the orbit of the eye? We get something that is kind of like this here as a shape. Right? And then here, like, we have the side and we have like a whole bunch of stuff there. But for the top, like for the orbit of the eye, we really get something like this. We get a plane like that, and then we get a plane like this, right? So we get this very sharp transition line right here. And this really creates a kind of box, really. Like, this is also kind of a box. You know, so the orbit of the eye, like, kind of crosses over somewhere here. So we don't really see it because there's simply a lot of fat on top of that and other stuff, and that certainly varies from person to person. So what we're left with, if we look at the surface there, is really just like two major planes if we look at a face from 3/4 or from profile. And we have here essentially something that I don't think has a name here, but let's simply call it the corner of the orbital ridge. Here is John Davis, Washington, just staring straight into your soul there. It's really showing us all of these things once more. You can see the nice kind of boxy shape like this. And then this plane here is kind of pointing down. On the forehead, the superciliary arches are not the only bumps that are really interesting to know if we want to be able to capture a really nice forehead on our 3D models. There is also something else on the forehead. This one's a bit less known because it's not as easy to spot. It's a bit more diffuse as a shape, but it is still as important as the rest of what we have here. And this is what we call the frontal eminences. So in this image here, it is this shape right here. So the frontal eminences, if you take a look at this reference here, it kind of looks like this huge, it kind of looks like a huge mass on the front of the forehead there. And it should be very, very easy to spot. And truth be told, it's a bit more subtle than that on most people, but it is also extremely important to really kind of be able to appreciate it. Here's our female skull. And you can really see the shape here. We can see it on both sides, actually. See these kind of two bumps there? And so what's interesting about it is that because it creates a bump, you get plane changes happening at it as well. We have the front here, and we can kind of draw a bit of a line that connects, and what we get is a sharp angle change happening here. So we have the front of the forehead here, and then we have this little section here that's a bit more at a diagonal angle, and we have a very clear angle break happening at the middle of the frontal eminences. I love this particular reference. So this is Mads Mikkelsen, and he's showing really clearly like some really interesting bumps going on the forehead. It's like just the camera angle itself, the fact that his head was shaved. It's like everything kind of makes this whole zone that's just very interesting to read, you know? So once again here, this is the orbit of the eye itself. See how clearly we can see the bump of the frontal eminences right here. Like there's like practically 3 bumps, you know? Like if you've never really studied this, you'll have a tendency to do the forehead as just something that's completely like round and smooth, you know? And once we take a look at these actual references, we realize that there's a whole lot going on here that like perhaps at first glance doesn't quite seem to make a lot of sense, you know? It's like, did he like bump his head? Like, did he hurt himself? Like, why is that, does he have a bump there? Well, and these are the frontal eminences. That's what they are. This bump here doesn't really have much of a name. At least I don't personally know of any name for this. I don't know if there is any name for that. It's not the suture that separates the frontal bone from the parietal bones. That suture would be about here or so. But you will see a bit of some very distinct angle changes happening here as well. I just don't know that there is a name for this. But here are the frontal eminences, and this is the orbit of the eye. Like, you need very specific angles to be able to really see them as clearly as that, but they certainly are there, you know? Here's a 3/4 picture of him. And once more, you can clearly see them, right? It's just that, like, for a lot of people, once you start to have hair that sort of covers this whole zone here, it becomes very hard to really kind of appreciate the fact that there is also a bit of a bump here towards the front. So we really get like bump 1, bump 2, and then bump kind of 3, you know, and we get our planes around that. But yeah, like see how clearly we get an angle change happening at the frontal eminence. Looking from a high angle down on this particular head, we can clearly see the shadow here, creating the frontal eminences. And you can see where the hairline is, you know, so if this is the summit, if you will, of the bumps themselves, like the hairline is just a bit higher than that. Now, obviously that will change from person to person. It's harder. It's often harder to see the frontal eminences on males than it is on females. And the reason for that is because on males, the fact that the superciliary arches and the orbital ridge is simply more prominent. There's more mass to it. It's simply bigger. The fact that these bumps are actually bigger makes it so that the frontal eminences, they seem to have less importance to the shape of the forehead there. I'm not sure that the frontal eminences are technically smaller on males than they are on females, but it certainly appear to be smaller because of how much volume and mass there is to the brow bone. So when we're kind of sculpting a face and we're really taking a look at a forehead, for me, it really helps to really think of 4 distinct bumps, you know? And so here we have number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. And if we take a look, we can clearly see the different speck highlights that is created on these different bumps. And so the top 2 ones here are the frontal eminences, and the 2 ones here on the bottom are the superciliary arches, you know? Like we get, this is Usain Bolt. We get like a bit of a valley here, kind of between the 2 superciliary arches. And we also get like a bit of a valley here. Yeah, so here we are again. You know, you can clearly see this kind of valley here that is kind of getting created here. And finally, from profile, here's that little bump that I said that I don't know has a name. Frontal eminences, ridge of the eye. We've talked about simply how heavier the brow is for males than it is for females, you know, which is visible here once more. But I would propose, and this isn't based off of exact research, it's simply based off my intuition by looking at a whole lot of faces through a lot of years there, but there is heaviness to the brow that is simply stronger for males than it is for females. So here is Robert Pattinson, and I've watched Tenet a few times at this point. I'm starting to understand it, I think. But I'll be honest, one of the things that I like to see the most while I'm watching that movie is simply Robert Pattinson's face. I love to just watch this guy. He's so like, he's got a presence on screen in that movie that is just, there's something like, it's actually the first movie that I watch, believe it or not, that has him in there. It's actually the first time that I watch a movie where he stars in it, and I'm like, oh, this guy's actually pretty good. And the thing I've been fascinated about is really just like how prominent his brow really is, you know? Like if you take a look at this here, right? So like the midline is like, let's say about here, right? Like the camera is obviously angled a little bit. Just see like see how far forward the brows project, like especially in relation to the cheekbones and the mid face there, you know, like there's this like the brows, they simply project out in a way that is extremely visible. So you get these smaller cheeks, these smaller cheekbones, and you get this wider brow, and it gives the appearance of the whole top of the skull to be just sort of lurching forward, just projecting forward than the rest of the face there. And as I said, this simply is stronger for males than it is for females. That across the board, you will see the brow projecting forward for males a lot more than how much you will see the cheekbones project forward. Whereas for females, it's actually usually the opposite. For females, you will often get the cheeks, you know, and there's more than the cheekbones in there. There's also layers of facial fat that contributes to that. Females simply have more fat in the midface than males have. So you combine having more fat in the midface with a less prominent brow bone for females, and you wind up in a situation where for females, the cheeks often project further forward than the brow, and on males, that relationship is inverted. So for males, the brows project forward more than the cheek does, you know? If we compare what's on here, so this is John David Washington, and Alicia Keys. we can see again, like just how heavier this whole zone here is. But if you were to compare, let's say, a picture of John David Washington with Robert Pattinson, what you would be able to appreciate is that his cheekbones and certainly his cheeks are a lot fuller there. There's simply a lot more volume here. So you get a bit of a better balance between how prominent the cheeks are versus the brow for, let's say, black males than what you would get for like typical white male, you know? All right, so let's complete the first part of the class by just re-enumerating the gender differences between males and females. And there's a few subtleties there that I haven't said yet. But so the differences between males and females is something that's been well documented. You know, like we have the benefit of everyone who does plastic surgery research. And there's a lot of information there that comes to us by that community. And so we have very, very clear idea of what are all the gender differences when it comes to the skull there. So in general, the skull for females is rounder than it is for males. So I can maybe write this down here. So we have roundness, let's say. So say male versus female. Skull differences. All right. This is already getting a bit of a mess, but that's fine. So first we have roundness. In general, male skulls have a tendency to be overall a bit more angular. You know, like this is actually very visible if we take a look at the jawline. But like also for the orbit of the eye, we've talked about that a little bit. It's going to be visible too if we take a look at, let's say, the corner of the mandible, which we'll talk about after the break. You guys will be able to also appreciate the fact that it simply is more angular here. So this little bump here, right? So this is on the male skull and this is on the female skull. See how like pretty much everything simply seems to be a bit rounder, a bit less angular. You know, like the whole forehead here is also very, very visible there. And the reason for that is because like for males, like the bone simply has a tendency to grow a bit more. And it does so because, well, bone is obviously a protection, right? It's a protection mechanism. So throughout evolution, males just happen to fight more than females, and therefore having a bone structure that gave them a bit more protection was beneficial. And so you wind up having these overly developed bumps left and right, you know, because it serves as protection there. So that's one of the really, really big differences there, right? And a lot of these are visible on the forehead. So male versus female skull differences. So we were talking about the superciliary arches. Being very, very different. So we have overall roundness, superciliary arches themselves. What else do we have? Bone thickness, actually. So thickness. Which is, you know, all more or less related there. But if you take a look here and you really compare the skull, so this is the male skull. Look at the thickness, not just for these here, but like even for the ridge here, for the orbital ridge. If you take a look at this here, like look at how thick all of this bone is. So this is the male skull, and this is the female skull. The female bone around the orbit of the eye is a lot thinner overall. It's a bit sharper too, you know, like most features are usually rounder, but when it comes to thinness of bone, the bone is a lot thinner on females than it is for males. So it creates these more sharp lines, I guess. The different borders are more clearly defined. Like, look at how incredibly thin this actually is right here. And if we compare it with the male version here. There are differences as far as the cranial box is concerned as well. It's a bit pointier for females, although, again, as we have seen, this varies tremendously from person to person. So pointier shape to the top. For females. And overall, skull size also changes a bit. So skull size changes because female skulls are slightly smaller. Because of everything we've said so far, it's just kind of naturally leads itself to that. But female skulls are actually a bit smaller than the male versions there. So skull size has a tendency to change. We saw that last week, when we were looking at anthropometrical data 2 weeks ago. So last class, we saw how anthropometrical data was changing between males and females, and the fact that for females, most of the measurements were actually smaller. So these are most of the facial features, and certainly the gender differences that I can think of right now. All right, let's move on to our first Q&A then. Yeah, if you guys want to interrupt and ask questions, there's quite a lot of you guys actually in the Saturday stream, so hope you all have some interesting questions. I'll also be keeping an eye out on the subscriber chat, and so if you guys don't have a microphone and you simply want to type out a question for the Q&A, it's a great time to do so. Yeah, so whoever wants to get us started for the Q&A, please go ahead. Hey, Kurosi.
Yeah, so I think I've seen some male faces, they have much more prominent or thick, in this case, bones like the glabella and the jaw. And from what I've read or heard, it's because of the level of testosterone. Is that's correct? I mean, I've seen some people like the Great Khali, if you know him, the wrestler, the Indian wrestler. Let me even pull him out. He has a really prominent jaw, and I kind of wonder, is that that doesn't look like a typical skull of a white male. I know that European skulls differ, and African skulls differ, but I just kind of wonder how is this like possible, and what kind of references should we look at if we have such exceptions like this one?
Yeah. Well, okay, so I mean, first of all, I'm not his doctor, so like I can only really speculate as far as what's going on here. But I mean, he looks like he has a typical case of acromegaly, which is the fact that like sometimes bone just doesn't stop growing. And yes, it is essentially caused by hormones. Therefore, testosterone is the main culprit here. And so what happens, is that like the bone simply has a tendency to grow more for males because it is protection. And what happens is that in certain people, well, bone simply never stops growing. Like as you age, bone will eventually stop to grow, at a certain age. But for some people, it just never does so. And so you wind up having like this overly defined facial structure like he has there. Like these people are also like often really, really tall for the same reasons. It's like the bone just never stops to grow, really. And without being his doctor, I can only really speculate, but I would say that sounds to me like that's very likely what is happening here.
Yeah, I've always just admired his face because it's just because of this jaw, because it's just so big, just really prominent and almost cartoonish, just almost cartoonish.
Yeah. I feel sorry for this guy. Oh, Jesus. It's like I'm getting vibes of Game of Thrones and Oberyn Martell there. Ooh, spoilers. Jesus. It's like the faces are just gonna pop, It's like I'm kind of looking forward to see one of these faces just like explode. Jesus. Yeah, I think that's what's going on here. You had a question, which was I think like what kind of references are you supposed to use? I think.
Yeah, because the ones that we just had a look at kind of differ from the skull that he has. So I don't know. Probably if we just look at the references of his face, that would be kind of enough. But yeah, that's my question.
Yeah. I mean, he obviously has the same facial features as everyone else has. They're just like a lot of them are just simply overgrown, you know? Like we were talking about the chin being rounder for females than it is for males, and because on males, essentially like what we call the mental trigone. We'll come back to that after the break, but it's like kind of bumps that are here, like right here. They also get a bit bigger for males than for females, and in his case here, it looks like they just never stop to grow really. So you wind up having this huge mass right there. Um, yeah, I mean, if you're going to sculpt him, you should obviously use him as a reference, you know, like, but he's obviously like, you know, last week when we were looking at like anthropometry and like, sorry, I keep saying last week, but it was last class when we were looking at anthropometry, you know, like, and the fact that, you know, some people will be fully out in outlier territory and like, what is the 99th percentile and stuff like that. Well, he would probably be one of those, you know. Um, he may be in VB like technically off the chart, like if you were to look at like anthropometry, because you know your chart will end at whoever has the most massive proportions, and it's unclear to me that in the book that we looked at 2 weeks ago during the anthropometry class that someone like him could have been in there somewhere. I mean, it is possible, but those were like anthropometrical measurements for like U.S. Army personnel. So it's very likely that someone like him was not even like in the sample size, perhaps, you know. So he would probably be even like technically off the chart, so to speak. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to go and kind of have accurate measurements for that. But I mean, you know, usually like it's very visible what should be overly developed, I suppose, you know?
Yeah, that was the thing that when I was doing my head, when I tried to measure things, judging by that book, I mostly used the 50th percentile, but I saw
Yeah.
that differed. It just differed from like the cheeks, the distance between the zygomatic. It kind of differed, and it went even all the way to the second percentile. And I was like, okay, yeah, I think that's fine if it's shown in the book. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, this guy would be off the chart, you know, like I would not use a 50th percentile for most measurements for this guy. There's a question in the chat from Kenny. For making a character look more heroic, which features could be pushed first to give the most impact? And then not having them look like aliens. It's a really good question, Kenny. So if you want to make someone look heroic, first thing you should pay attention to is facial symmetry. You should make the face symmetrical. That's like the first thing, like as much as possible, because you know someone who is heroic is very likely to have good genes. You know, like we're not talking about an anti-hero in this case, unless you know that's maybe a bit of a different one there. But certainly, like I would go towards what is one symmetrical to what is a lot more square and young. So I would not go for features that are very well. When I mean square, I actually mean that more for that more like angular, you know, like a nice angularness to the different features, but yet still have very soft transitions, you know, like and often these things are displayed on like younger faces, you know, like if you take a look at the jaw here, like I really love this particular jaw right here, right? Like it's not fully symmetrical, but it's very symmetrical. And look at how nice these different angles are, you know, like they're very nice, they're very straight. So you should definitely go for these straighter sort of lines and these sharper corners in like different places without being overly defined, you know, like you could certainly define these corners to the point, you know, that they become just sharp lines, almost like hard surface sculpting, you know, you definitely don't want to go there. You want to keep softer, like soft transitions, but you definitely want to go for like these very nice angular lines left and right. A lot of symmetry. I mean, at some point, this becomes my own interpretation of what a heroic face looks like, of course. But you know, like if you take a look at, let's say, Superman's face, right? Like the typical heroic face. It's like you more or less have all these things on display there. You know, it's very symmetrical. It's very sharp corners, very straight lines. But it also like it has a very strong appearance to it too. Like the jaw is very, very strong, you know, like it's very prominent. What you probably also want to do is to reduce the amount of baby baby features. So for example, you want to go for these smaller eyes. You want to go for less fat in the mid face, you know, so this whole zone here, this is what we call the mid face. There's a lot of fat, you know, like if you look at like a baby face, right? There is something that we call the buccal fat. Let's just look at like baby face. If you take a look at like a baby face, right? You have this a lot of roundness on the cheeks that gets created by what we call the buccal fat. Which we will come back in 2 weeks' time. I would say that you can make a more heroic male face by reducing the amount of buccal fat or just fat in the mid face. You know, so anything that makes a face look like a baby face, I would tone these things down when making a very heroic face. You know, and you combine that with symmetry. You combine that with relatively young-looking features, a lot of nice straight lines left and right, and you got a recipe there for a pretty good heroic face, you know? Like, we could talk more subjectively about that, but I think that's probably a pretty good starting point. All right, guys, I guess that completes the first part of the class. Let's take a break. Everyone, hi, this is Laura Gallagher, and I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you why I decided to found a company called Outgang. I have taken it upon myself to produce every week masterclass level content on topics that I believe are very important for people to know and to master if they are to succeed as a character artist. This content is complete with chapters, handout files that you can download and keep for yourself, and I even spent about an hour interacting and giving feedback or answering questions. If you become a member, you'll be able yourself to vote in the future for the kind of content that you want to see on the platform. If you can't afford the monthly price, you can also help us tremendously simply by telling a friend about us or subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's all I want to say. I thank you for your time, and I hope I will see you online as part of the Outgang community in the future. Take care. Here's how many people there is right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 10 of you guys. Kind of wondering, I'm not sure what the record is. I think the record probably was during Magdalena's interview, I think. But this wouldn't be far from it. It's good to see people, it's good to see the community grow and to see more and more of you guys here as the weeks go on. All right, I think we can continue. I hope you're all back from break and that you had a good break. Let me go ahead here and switch my screen over once more. All right, so let's continue where we left off. So before the break, we've pretty much dissected everything that has to do with the forehead and the overall shape of the skull. We've looked at quite a lot of stuff there. I want to say this again, like if you really want to create a really compelling face and you really want to sculpt a really compelling face, it's good to really think about planes, you know, really try to always capture different facial planes. You know? Try to really think of when you're looking at references, when you're looking at, and you're trying to sculpt your 3D models, like if something is overall completely round, you know, like this here, this is completely round right here, right? And that's fine because, well, it's, you know, there's simply a mass of hair in there, so you kind of expect that shape. But like the face isn't really round anywhere, you know, like there isn't a lot of surfaces that are perfectly round. There certainly are some, you know, there are certainly some around the nose especially, but overall, like you really always try to think in terms of very discrete planes, you know, try to really read where the planes are on your different references. And we've seen quite a lot of them so far. One thing I haven't really mentioned about the frontal eminences, maybe I just want to mention it right here. You know, like the frontal eminences, when we take a look at them from, let's say, 3/4, right, we've clearly seen that there is an angle change happening at the frontal eminences. You know, straight line here, frontal eminences there. But that is true from every angle, you know. It's not true only from 3/4 or from profile, you know. Like if we take a look at a face from under, you know, we still have like these frontal eminences are hugely prominent here, right? and we get this diagonal plane here on the side, and then we get a front part in between the frontal eminences that is more or less straight. Like here it looks very round, but if I choose an angle like this, you'll see that it becomes a bit straighter there. You know, so like you get a side plane here, and then you get a flatter front plane right here. So yeah, like it's good to always kind of think of the face in terms of like really discrete planes. You know, it really helps to just capture different plane changes. Like look at the whole skull actually, you know, like this is completely flat, this is completely straight, this is completely straight, you know, like straight, straight, straight. It's like you just get all these straight lines left and right, you know, and if you can really capture that, you'll get faces that are way more compelling, you know, and especially if you get the angle changes at the proper location, of course, you know. From side view, straight again, parietal eminences, there's a corner here, there's a turn, and then we have a straight line on top, you know. So really try to just analyze these different shapes on your references. Try to find really those different straight lines, those flat planes, and really try to emphasize those when you are sculpting your 3D models. You can see the amount of asymmetry in this face too. I mean, it is pretty much facing forward, you know, but like this whole zone here is just a bit wider than it is there. You know, like this whole zone here feels a lot like, and even the kind of angles themselves, right? It's like here we have a bit of a depression here at the temporal fossa. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But on this side here, it's like you get this whole plane here that is like very flat from like the corner of the ear or like the top part of the ear all the way to the top. But in this case here, it's kind of creating a depression that has a bit of a kind of like a V shape, I guess, but on the side, you know, like there's a lot of asymmetry here that goes beyond just, you know, moving the corner of the mouth a bit higher there. I mean, you know, like I do that too, you know, it's like when I'm sculpting faces, I sculpt faces like that are very symmetrical, you know, like I kind of do that too. But when we look at real life, like we see that like if you really want to capture like skull, like a very naturalistic face and very naturalistic proportions and asymmetry, like the best is probably even to sculpt the face fully asymmetrically, which is definitely something that we should put in one of the challenges at some point, you know, like sculpt the face, any face that you want, but make it like sculpt it from beginning to end in a way that is fully asymmetrical. You know, you cannot use symmetry at any point. You always have to sculpt with symmetry off, you know. I really like for us to do that particular challenge at some point, like especially for one of the heads that we have. We'll certainly do that at some point if we don't do it next week. I guess we'll see what happens there. But I think sooner or later we should definitely do that, you know, and yeah, it would be a really, really good exercise just to also work your brain and really kind of develop your knowledge further of anatomy and left and right divergences, perhaps, but also just to train your artistic eye. All right, let's get back on track. What are we talking for the second part of the class? Let me bring up the plan. So for the second part of the class, we will pretty much be talking about everything that isn't related to the frontal part there of the face. And so we have a lot to say as far as the side of the face is concerned, especially the temporal line and the temporal fossa. A lot of this more or less reads like a bunch of different disconnected subjects, and they more or less are. You know, there's a lot to say as far as the skull is concerned, and different zones in ways that are more or less isolated. So that is more or less what we'll do for the second part of the class there. Let's talk first about the temporal line and the perhaps even what we could call a temporal plane, I suppose, on the side there. Let's go through a few of those. We'll also be talking about differences in terms of aging. We'll see, maybe I'll keep that for the end, but I think I'll try to weave that in the conversation as much as possible. How does the head change as it ages? And certainly how does the skull change, and how does that change the appearance of the face completely? It's probably surprising. There's things in there I think would probably surprise you. But before we get to that, let's talk about the temporal plane. What I call the temporal plane is this more or less flat zone that we have on faces right here. I don't think that's a technical anatomical term, but I still like to use it and to refer to this whole thing as a temporal plane because it is first relatively flat, and second of all, well, there's more going on there than simply the temporalis or the temporal fossa. Let's talk about this a little bit. So here is an image that shows the muscle called temporalis. So the muscle that we have on the temples on both sides of the head, right? So this is called the temporalis. We'll come back on that next week. We'll talk a little bit more about its function and stuff. But for this week, at least, what we can really observe here is that temporalis has an attachment point, sort of egg shape here on the side of the head there. And this is very clearly visible. We can clearly see the attachment point of temporalis on the skulls that we have. So let's bring up the skulls. And you can clearly see, if we take a look at the male skull, but the female one too, in fact, I believe the female one's even more visible, right? See, like we were talking about the fact that the skull, like the bone simply looks rougher when there is a muscle and tendon that is connecting to a specific spot, right? And this is clearly visible here. Like you can clearly see where is the line here that forms the border of temporalis and where the muscle really connects to the bone there. You can clearly see the line here because it's a lot rougher than it is somewhere else. On both heads here, in both the male and female head, you can also observe how prominent is the suture separating the parietal bone from the temporal bone, which is the bone in green right here. And then you have here the sphenoid bone, and then this would be the frontal bone, which are very, very weird, by the way. The sphenoid bone, I believe is considered to be the most complex bone of the human body. Not necessarily in terms of size. It's like actually the bone that's here that you guys can see creates what is the more lateral wall, I suppose, and the back of the orbit of the eye there. So all of that is what we call the sphenoid bone. Knowing anything about the sphenoid bone isn't necessary when it comes to artistic anatomy, but it is considered to be the most complex bone of the human body. Actually, it could be the ethmoid bone, now that I think about it, which are actually right next to each other. They're both highly complex bones, really, more or less the point there. But I believe the ethmoid bone actually is the most complex one. But the sphenoid bone is also extremely complex, and they're both right next to each other there. And the reason why they're very, very complex, because they have a lot of attachment points for a lot of different things. There's a lot of sinuses and other things that really depend on the shape of those, and that get created by the shape of these two bones there. So I said the sphenoid bone, which is actually the one that we can see right here on the side, and that creates this kind of shape right here. So actually the ethmoid bone is the one that's right in the middle there, and so I will correct myself. That is the most complex bone of the human body. Take a look at the shape here. We just look at like pictures of that. Like there's so much like folds and complexity, and like all of the little bumps that you see here, they all have a really good reason to exist, because a lot depends on those. Since this is the part that's like right in the middle of your face there. And there's like a whole lot of different sinuses and like other things that get formed by the shape of this. But I mean, both the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone, they don't really create surface shape. It's good to know about that, but there isn't a purpose to study them beyond perhaps simply knowing where their location is in the face when it comes to artistic anatomy there. Which is why the ethmoid bone is not even part of this. Like it would be this little part here that's white, and here as well. But for the most part, it didn't really bother to try and color code that. But so this is called the sphenoid bone right here. And so we can see that the whole suture here is very, very prominent, both on the female skull and on the male skull. They're both very, very prominent, but you don't really see them too much because you have the temporalis muscle that is right on top of it. Sometimes the shape of temporalis and the temporal plane, which is this whole plane here on the side, is kind of simplified to something like this here, like a part of a sphere that's been cut off on like both sides. Something like this here. And it's largely correct as a very simple shape, but it's worked to also kind of push our understanding of these things a bit further than that. Now, I don't want to talk too much about temporalis, even though the subject of temporalis and the interplay between that and bone is something that we can't cleanly separate. You know, these two topics certainly are very interrelated. What I will say today, as far as that's concerned, is I want to point out again just how extremely deep is the temporal fossa right here, right? Like the actual temples here. When we look at a picture of someone and, we have skin and fat and everything else that's on top of that, the temporal planes look very flat. There isn't necessarily much there in terms of depth there. But there still is, on certain people, a very appreciable cavity right here that we can kind of see on the face if the lighting is right. And it helps to see just how incredibly deep this really is, because temporalis has a tendency to conform itself to the shape here, to the sort of diagonal plane that we have here on the skull itself. Let's look at a few of these 3D scans to really better appreciate the shape of all of this. So first, let me go down and maybe we can start with the males. Yeah, so this kind of explains why on this particular face, we can clearly see like that there is certainly a flatter side here to the face. We can see where the shadow is here. So we can obviously appreciate that there is a bit of flatness here on the side, right? But for certain people, you will start to really get a really, really pronounced cavity here. And temporalis is a muscle that you can develop just like any other muscle of the human body. It's one of the muscles that help to masticate, so to eat. And, if you eat gum all day long or something else, I'm not sure that gum does it, although you have gum that's very chewy, I guess. This muscle will simply develop itself just like any other one. So what happens is that on certain people, you will see that temporalis will be very, very, very thick, which is kind of the case here. But what's interesting about it is that temporalis does not does not fill up the fossa in a nice, neat way. It actually creates a bit of a bump here, So temporalis is here. As I said, we'll come back and talk more about this next week. But for now, I just want you guys to appreciate the fact that temporalis is not something that's completely flat. And certainly, what would expand on the muscle itself is the part here that is actual muscle fibers. Since this part here that's right in the middle is actually made of tendon, and you cannot really make tendon become larger, really. As temporalis becomes bigger, you get this kind of cylindrical sort of tube here that more or less gets created. But what's interesting is that on certain people, the tendinous part like this really recedes really, really deeply within the temporal fossa. So you get this kind of cavity here, and you have the body of temporalis here and here on the back. Now for this particular head here, you can just see the differences in volume for temporalis between this head here and this head here. This is an older man, so he probably isn't chewing as much gum as the previous one. And so you can start to see that this zone becomes a lot flatter, as a result of temporalis having a bit less volume there. And as a consequence, we can also start to see more cleanly where is the actual, what we call the temporal line. So the line that separates, let's say, the top border here of our temporal plane, the temporal line. You can start to see here that it's a bit easier to spot. You can kind of find the plane change here a bit easier on this head here because temporalis is simply smaller there. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to look at this whole thing here because this side plane here for the temporal plane. Oh, look at how huge this bump is for temporalis right there. See, this is highly developed. It's even sticking out of the side of the head there. But the thing that's also interesting about this flat plane here is the fact that it's not flat as in cleanly connecting the corner of the orbit of the eye with the back of the skull. It almost looks like a plane that almost wants to make its way further inward inside the head. Let me take a screenshot of this and go in Photoshop. See here how this plane is really angled kind of like this, and we can see on this side here. So here's the temporal line. So the temporal line here and there, which is the upper border, the extremity of the temporalis, where it connects with the skull. But yeah, you can see how this plane here is not pointing towards the the front of the face, or pointing towards the corner of the supraorbital ridge, it's actually pointing further inward. And that becomes obvious to us when we look at the shape of the skull and we realize how incredibly deep the temporal fossa really is. On both males and females. All right, a few tidbits while we're here. Since we're looking at the side of the head. This whole mass that sticks out right here, this is what we call the mastoid process. Let me take a screenshot of this. So this thing here, this is called the mastoid process. Of the temporal bone. What it actually is, this is an attachment point for a muscle that we call the sternocleidomastoid. Let me try and write that without making a mistake there. So sternocleidomastoid, which essentially connects to this and just makes its way down the neck. We'll talk more about that next week. But so the sternocleidomastoid is very, very visible on people, and you can clearly see the mastoid process too on most heads, really. So let's go through a few of these different heads just to see what that looks like. Yeah, you can clearly see this whole huge tube right here. This is the sternocleidomastoid, and it's very, very interesting when you look at it. Let's say from back view, right? Like especially if you have someone who's very thin. And don't necessarily have a lot of muscle definition for the rest of what's happening in the neck here. You can clearly see when you look at a face from back view here, like there would be the mastoid process about here. It's about there. And you can clearly see on both sides the back side here of sternocleidomastoid. And it creates this angular plane. Here and here, and connected to it is the sternocleidomastoid. And so what you get is that you get, if we take a look at the planes, right? Because the mastoid process is very much far out on the sides there, you get this kind of like side planes like this. And then you get the back here of the neck. There is something that we call the Frankfurt Plane. And so right in front of the mastoid process, which is right here, right in front of that, we have the auditory canal, which is this little thing here. It's this little hole right there. So this is obviously where the sound comes from within the ear itself. And so in and of itself, this part here isn't terribly exciting when it comes to anatomy itself. I mean, we can kind of find where it is on the skulls, but by in and of itself, this is really just a hole within the skull, right in front of the mastoid process. But what is interesting about it is that as plastic surgeons, anatomists, and other people have been looking for a bit of a standardization when it comes to how should the head be angled forward, they decided on something that we now call the Frankfurt Plane. So, the question is actually very simple, right? It's like, is this head looking forward right now? Well, the answer is yes, but maybe you don't really know whether it is facing forward, because is it really? Or is it now facing forward? I just rotated a few degrees and now maybe this is how it should be placed, right? Or what about like that? Why isn't this valid? It's a question that's obviously very, very important because, when we start looking at like angles, when we start looking at like how, let's say, things are prominent in relation to something else, we have to define a actual orientation for the head that we decide is the proper forward-facing orientation for the head there. And so that's how we came up with what we call the Frankfurt Plane. So the Frankfurt Plane, and you can say that your head is looking forward perfectly. If you can have a straight line that is parallel to the ground, that connects the upper border of the auditory canal. So if I just draw here using the transpose line, if you can draw a line that is perfectly parallel to the ground plane, that starts from here, from the upper border of the auditory canal, and it goes straight to the bottom border of the orbit of the eye. You can see where it's right here. Let's take a screenshot so that we can overemphasize this. This is what we call the Frankfurt Plane. So if you can draw a line that connects the upper border of the auditory canal with the bottom border, this is the orbit of the eye, the bottom border of the orbit of the eye, the line that connects these 2 points is what we call the Frankfurt Plane. And your head is defined as looking perfectly forward if the Frankfurt Plane is perfectly parallel to the ground. Once I bought these skulls and I opened them in ZBrush, they were actually not in the proper orientation. I had to rotate them slightly. But I've done so for both the male and the female, so we know that they are both anatomically in the proper position. Let's talk a little bit about the zygomatic bone then. And so the zygomatic bone is this very small bone. It's really not big, right? It's this little bone here that's on the sides there. And it has also a very, very interesting shape to it. Now, we've talked last week of something that we call the zygion. If you guys remember, that was one of the facial landmarks that we have used for anthropometry. Certainly, if we look at the model from this angle here, it's very easy to spot where the zygion is. So let's start with that, and then let's talk about the shape of the zygomatic arch afterward. We talked last class about the zygion, which is the widest point of the cheekbones, which is right here. This is the widest point. Not here or there. It's all the way in the back. It's all the way in the back. It's further back than people usually think that it is, And you can see that from there, the front of the zygomatic arch, or the zygomatic bone at that point, creates a kind of trapezius. It tapers significantly as we go from the zygion all the way to the front. And that's actually very, very interesting, Like we get this very sharp corner that happens right here. It's like the front part here of the zygomatic arch, although at that point we're more on the maxilla and on the under the orbit of the eye itself. But you can see that like there's really like a flat line there that more or less connects the two orbits of the eye together, but there is a very sharp turn that happens on the outside of the zygomatic arch. And what's interesting about that is the actual angle to it. This particular angle here and here, that's about 120 degrees. Or depending how you do the measurement, you would have complementary to that would be 60 degrees. So you can say it however you want really, but this is interesting because it does not create a 90-degree turn, as we could maybe assume, especially if we're looking at references that are highly distorted because of the focal length of the camera, like the front of the cheek will simply look a lot larger than even how it looks at the zygion there. So you could think that the side plane, if you will, for the cheek is fully, let's say, flat. If you're looking at someone from front view, it would be like on the side, I guess, or foreshortened at that point. But it's actually not that. Like there is the angle from the front of the zygomatic bone and the orbit of the eye itself creates about 120 degrees towards the side plane there. And that's actually, we can actually measure that, like, if we're not really sure about this. And if we kind of want to see what this looks like on 3D models, we can certainly go ahead and do that as well. Let me go back in ZBrush, right? So yeah, so how am I getting that actual number? Well, I'm just measuring it. I'm just using the transpose line here, and I'm simply putting the transpose line like this over the cheekbones. And as I'm doing that on the top left here, I can see what angle there is to that, you know. Fortunately, as I let it go, I don't see the, fortunately, I lose the angle value there. But if you guys take a look, you know, and we take a look at the angle there, see how it's about like 30 degrees or so, maybe give or take a few degrees on top of that. So this is about 30 degrees from what will be the vertical axis, I suppose. And this actually, this line here actually holds true across almost all faces that we have here. Take a look at that, 60 degrees. This is the exact same angle that we have here on the side. And here as well. See how the light cleanly follows this actual line that I have here? So 30 to 40 degrees from the vertical axis, or about 120 degrees if you start from the horizontal line. So obviously on top of that, we have a lot of fat. Especially for females, there's a lot of fat in the mid-face, so that will soften the transitions significantly. But even with a lot of fat on top of this, we can still appreciate the actual angle of this terminator that we have for the light right here, and how it's pretty much exactly the same. She has a lot less fat, so it's a bit easier to see where the front and the back is for the cheekbones. Let's do something here. Let me just cut through and take like a cross section of this. And we have this 30 degrees, or at that point, whichever reference, whichever axis of reference you want to use there. But we have always more or less the same angle that shows up on pretty much all the faces that we have. And that is true for males as well, as you can see. These angles are all pretty much perfectly aligned. So the zygyon is actually here in this case. So this would be the cheekbone right here. You know, so the zygyon is actually quite far back, really. And it's good to know too that, like, if our face is pointing directly forward, the zygomatic arch will pretty much be exactly aligned with the Frankfurt Plane, which means that looking at a face from side view, should always have the zygomatic arch and the zygomatic bone, which is creating a straight line here. Now, a lot of people get this wrong. Yeah, you can see it here once more. A lot of people get this wrong, and they think that the cheekbone actually sort of goes vertically up like this, which is actually a mistake, since the cheekbone is actually very, very straight. And it's kind of like this, actually. But the reason why people get this wrong is because we have a tendency to confuse facial fat with bony structure, you know? Like, the bone is actually like this. So the bone, we can't see the ear canal in this case, of course, because we have the ear on top. But if you're looking for it, you pretty much just have to find where the tragus is. So this little piece of cartilage that just sticks out here, so this is the tragus. Tragus, like that. And so the zygomatic arch is pretty much aligned straight with that. So we find the orbit of the eye, let's say the border would be about here or so, right? So, you know, we more or less have something like this as far as the zygomatic arch is concerned. Now, the reason why people get this wrong and why there are mistakes made with this is because there is fat on top of the zygomatic arch. There is something here that we call a SUF fat, but there is more than that as well. And those fat pads are not necessarily cleanly aligned with the zygomatic arch. So we kind of get this in this case here, we kind of get a bump that seems to sort of move diagonally across towards the top and towards the back like that. But we must not confuse that with the bone under the skin. It's not the same thing. But yeah, especially for females, you get a lot of variability there when it comes to the zygomatic arch. Like here we can kind of see, like we're pretty much looking for where we have a plane change going from the temporal plane down to what we could call the masseter plane, perhaps. You know, like I'm sort of looking here, I can see this angled plane here for the temporalis, and I can find here pretty much where is the zygomatic arch right there by simply finding the tragus in the back and the orbit of the eye here. So it's actually more here. And I can clearly see from there that I get these nice angle changes happening at the zygomatic arch. But yeah, that's true when you have faces that are lean enough when it comes to facial fat in the mid cheeks or in the mid face, that this relationship certainly holds true. So here it's true as well. Tragus is a bit low, and if we look for the zygomatic arch, it would actually be a bit higher. It's like her ears are actually abnormally low, although now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, no, okay, no, this follows the Frankfurt Plane, actually. But yeah, in this case, the zygomatic arch is maybe just a few millimeters higher than that, you know? But we always have this more or less straight line going towards the back for the zygomatic arch. But yeah, this whole bump here, this is not the zygomatic arch. This is fat. This is the zygomatic arch. So we talked about the shape of the zygomatic bone. In certain cases, you can kind of also appreciate a little bit the fact that there is this downward slope here. You know, like if we look at the bottom of the zygomatic bone, for people who have a very low amount of facial fat in the mid cheeks, you will start to be able to appreciate first very clearly the fact that there is a very sharp angle change that is happening here, first of all. But second of all, you can also appreciate sometimes the fact that this whole zone here that is right under the bone. Let's bring up the skull actually. This whole zone here is actually pointing downwards a little bit. And you can kind of appreciate that in people who have a very low amount of facial fat. You can kind of see this plane here for the front of the zygomatic arch. You can start to see that show a little bit on certain faces. But yeah, the moment that someone has a lot of facial fat that fills up, you know, like she does right now, you don't see that at all. Like that's completely gone. But on this older face, we can start to see this downward slope that is starting to form here if we compare, you know. Here she's very young, her cheeks are very full. Here is an older individual, and she is starting to lose a lot of that facial fat, and everything is starting to sag downward a little bit. So you start to see the border, or rather the underplane, if you will, for the zygomatic arch that is starting to appear here. Wow, look at this volume here, just how much fat there is here. This is huge. Yeah, we can see this angle here once more. But yeah, we'll certainly come back on this whole zone, and we'll talk about that more in the context of facial fat once we get to that, which I'm looking forward to, because there's a lot of dissection pictures I want to show you guys. Next, let's talk about the nose a little bit. We haven't really talked about that too much so far. Let's talk about the nose a little bit and the bones there. So for the nose, right? If we take a look at the bones around the nose. So we have here the nasal bones, these things here that are in blue. Now, first of all, there is a suture that separates the nasal bones from what we call the maxilla, which is this teal colored bone right here. So this is the maxilla, and this is the nasal bone. And first of all, we can already see that there is a suture that connects these two bones together. And this suture has a tendency to recede inward a little bit, has a tendency to create a bit of a valley there. So if we go through these phases again, on certain of these phases, we can clearly see where the suture is on the surface. It's this line right here, this here, and this here on this side. Once more, we can see the suture right here. It's not visible on everyone, but in certain cases, as you can see, we have this nice round part here to the nose bridge. And then we get this clear line that runs down across the middle of the nose there, which is the suture that separates the nasal bone from the maxilla. And there's a lot of variability there too, of course, across people. Oh, we can spot it here once more. There's a lot of variation there, of course. One thing that really changes a lot actually is how prominent the bony part of the nose is in relation to the cartilaginous part of the nose. Let's look at a few images of that. So you may already know that the nose is composed first of this here, which is made of bone. We have the suture here that we've been talking about. So this is what we call a nose bridge. And this here, I guess, is just, cartilage of the nose, you know, so that the front of the nose can be very flexible so that you don't break your nose the moment that you hit a wall somewhere with the front of your nose there, unless you hit it really, really strong, right? But yeah, so this whole part here is actually made of cartilage, and there often are plane changes happening there as well. So the separation, where we turn from bone over to cartilage, you will see a lot of variation there too. Like you will see people that will have noses that will look like this, right? You will find people that have a nose like this, where we can clearly spot where is the bony part of the nose and where is the cartilaginous part of the nose. You have people who are completely the opposite of that. People whose part of the nose, which is made of cartilage, is actually receding inward. So you have the nose bridge right here, which is this section here. So this would be the nose bridge. And then this is the cartilage part. So there's a lot of variation when it comes to the plane change, if there is one that happens at the nose bridge. So there isn't always necessarily a plane change that happens at the nose bridge, but there often is one. And what's interesting about it is that it doesn't happen only from profile, but it also actually happens from front view and from 3/4. We can actually spot, because part that is made of cartilage within the nose is often thinner than the part, the bony part that is created from the maxilla right here and created from the nasal bone. The whole opening of the nose, by the way, there is a name for that. Call it the nasal aperture. I think a lot of people call it that as well. This whole opening here for the bone. Let's go ahead and ZBrush. This whole opening for the bone. It's called the nasal aperture, but you will also see the piriform aperture in different places. So let's just write the name of this down. It's called the piriform aperture or nasal aperture. And what's interesting about it is that the moment that you add the cartilage on top, you realize that none of these lines are perfectly vertical. At least it doesn't often happen that these things are perfectly vertical, right? Like if we add the cartilage of the nose here, from profile you get pretty much a triangle. And so the whole line here of the nasal aperture is not a line that is vertically straight, it's angled on the side. And the bony part here is often thicker than the cartilaginous part, which is often thinner. And so what you get is something like this. We can clearly see here, if you take a look at this here, you can clearly see a bump here that runs all the way down the nose. And this is the opening of the nasal aperture. So if you want to spot where does the nose turn from bone to cartilage, you simply have to look for a plane change. And we can more or less spot it right here. So the part on top, the nose bridge, if you will, is often, let's look at this first. The nose bridge is often thicker. You can see it here too, like her nose is almost perfectly straight, but it's not. There's a bump here. And we can see here the side wall, if you will, the bony wall for the nose. And we can see that this section here that is made of cartilage is just ever so slightly thinner than the bony part that is on top of it. All right. You start to get some weird stuff happening for people who had broken noses in their life. So this is Owen Wilson. Probably would not be nearly as famous as he is if he did not have a broken nose. And you can clearly see like you can find, again, like this is very straight, this is very thick. So this is the bony part of it. And you can really appreciate how like his cartilage seemed to have been kind of like either broken or, you know, there's like something about the cartilage that really isn't all that straight anymore. And once more, we can appreciate just the fact that there's this kind of thickening here on the side of the nasal aperture. This is John Bernthal. Same thing. It's got a super wide nasal aperture. Like it's so open. It's like it's huge, you know, like look at this whole bump here. From side view, here we can, again, clearly appreciate the thickening at the nasal aperture. And from side view, you can clearly spot it once more. The thing about the nasal aperture that is also interesting is not just the top part, but it's also the bottom part of it. And this is something that people, again, don't necessarily get right if they haven't really studied this. Like here's what the nasal aperture looks like from under, right? You can see how the middle part is actually projecting a lot further forward. You know, so the nasal aperture is kind of like that here. So this point right here, that's right in the middle. This thing actually has a name. This thing here is called the anterior nasal spine. Anterior nasal spine. There's a little bump here that really sticks out much further. So when you're sculpting someone's face, make sure that you really are making this middle part of the nose, you know, like projecting further forward than the side of the nose. We can clearly see the anterior nasal spine right here. Take a look at that. See how much it sticks outward? And how the side here of the nasal aperture really recedes very far back. It really recedes far back, and then it projects forward again as we hit the sides there, if you will, of the nasal aperture, and as we go up towards the nose bridge. So yeah, make sure to really, really make this here projecting forward. We can clearly appreciate that here. See, there's this whole thickening here. This whole bump here is projecting much further forward than the sides of the nostrils, or what we'll call the wings of the nostril. A bit less true here. Yeah, so there too, as with everything else when it comes to the face, a lot of variation in nature. So this whole zone here, there isn't much else to talk about. We've talked about the zygomatic arch, but it's so modulated with fat that it makes more sense to talk more about the cheeks in the context of fat. So we will do that. So there's more or less just the jaw that's kind of left for us to really talk about. We haven't really talked so far. So the jaw itself. Let's start by defining a few anatomical landmarks there, and then we can maybe talk also in the context of aging how the jaw changes, because it changes quite a lot. So first, the jaw is obviously this whole zone here. This is what we call the mandible. So this and this is the mandible. And so as far as the mandible is concerned, there's a few things that are really interesting to point out. And first, the thing I want to point out before anything else, let's start by just talking about the chin a little bit, and then we'll make our way further towards the back there. But let's start with the chin before. We've said that the chin is not as prominent on females than it is on males, because this whole zone here simply gets overly developed because of testosterone. And the chin has a lot of different names, like depending on which part of the chin that you are talking about. But one of the things that I would like you guys to really memorize as far as the chin is concerned, this whole zone here, is something that we call the mental trigone. Let me write that down. So mental trigone. There are three important bumps to the chin. One here, one there, and one here. And you can appreciate them on the female skull as well. Get 1 through 3, and these three together, they form a triangle. And you can also kind of see that there's a bit of a line here. So there are more subtle plane changes that kind of happen there. Because in the middle, there's, like the jaw as it closes, it's actually two halves that get welded together right in the middle. So just like for everything else, every other suture we have on the body, it doesn't necessarily always connect at a flat angle there. But, we don't really see that too much, But what we certainly see is the mental trigone. So right this here. So there's three bumps that form this. First, this one here, which we call the mental eminence. And then we get the two bumps here, which we call the mental tubercles. And you get this triangular shape to it from these three different bumps. Now, of course, for certain people, I don't have an image of this right now, but we can just bring one here really quickly. Like for certain people, the symphysis, which is this separation here, this thing here. Maybe I can write that down. Let me write that down right now. So for certain people, this will create an angle that goes inward as opposed to outward, which is why some people have like a double chin, If we take a look at first person that comes to my mind with a double chin is John Travolta. If you look at his chin here, and let's find a young version of him. This is the reason why people like him get a bit of a sort of like a double chin sort of thing that's kind of happening here, because as the jaw closes, as it fuses in the middle during development, it will join itself at an angle that may create a bit of a bump here. So we can clearly see where are the mental tubercles on him. It's these two bumps right here. But collectively, these three different bumps, for most people, they kind of join together in a way that creates a very flat surface. Like it's not most people that have a symphysis that is receding inward. For most people, this will actually create a flat plane that simply connects the 3 points together there, just like that. That's for most people. Let's come back on those afterward, just like this here, right? So if we take a look at this here, there's a very small amount of receding here. So obviously we don't really see where the under of the jaw is, but I mean, for at the very least, we can appreciate that there is a flat plane like this, right? There is a point here. This is our mental eminence, and then we have the 2 points right here forming the mental trigone. He's got a bit of a recession here. Whereas this guy does not. There's no recession, but we can still appreciate the flatness here. Just like pretty much the forehead, it is more developed in males than it is in females. Therefore, females have a tendency to have a chin that is slightly pointier than males, but in both cases, we still have the same information on there. We still have that mental trigone. So when you look at it from side, then what happens is that the mental eminence will simply be the further point forward, and the 2 mental tubercles will be receded back, you know, when you look at a head from profile there. So you often get this kind of, like, it's very round on certain people, but in other cases like this one here, you really start to get some really beautiful plane changes happening. You got a plane here, plane there, and then you get a plane there. I guess you could also describe the shape as a bit of a maybe like a bit of a semicircle, depending on how you place the light, depending on how you kind of look at it. It will kind of create a bit of a circular arc that kind of connects these 3 points together. I guess you could also define it like that. And so it's simply less prominent on females than it is on males. So you get overall a rounder chin when it comes to females. But that's pretty much it. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the context of when people age in just a few minutes, but let's complete the rest of what we have to say as far as the mandible is concerned. So other than that, so the mandible, as you can see, there's a corner here as well. There is a corner here. And for males, you know, depending how their chin is, it may, or how the corner of their mandible is, it may get so large that, like, you get this flat plane here, or this flat line that is connecting the, or that is creating the bottom of the mandible itself. And then, like, this develops so much that it quite literally starts to stick out like that, you know? And so you get a bit of a, you get a point here where you have, where you can see the jaw kind of goes up and then starts to go down again if you were to look at a profile. I don't think I have an exact image of this, but we can certainly go through these different 3D models and see if anyone is like that. And then to it will connect the masseter as the muscle there. So yeah, you know, like we can kind of see it here, right? Like we have this line here that is relatively straight. There's a bit of fat here on top, which is the jowl fat. We'll come back to that. And then there's an angle here. And then we get an angle that is not as sloped back as we had on the front there. Get this here, then we get a turn. Then we have this section here. Now, we can't really cleanly see the rest of those planes that we saw, the rest of those angle changes, because there's just too much stuff on top. there is most prominently the masseter muscle, but in the back here there is more than that too. There's salivary gland and other stuff like that. But at the very least, we can clearly point out here where is the corner. And this is actually the same corner where we would draw the anterior border of the masseter there. It's more or less the same location. And the angle of the jaw itself. So although technically this is called that, this is called the angle of the jaw. If we do look at the jaw, we'll see that the jaw, like the back section, if you will, the what we commonly call the ramus, by the way, this is what we call the ramus right here. This is called the body of the mandible. We can see that between the ramus and the body of the mandible, there isn't a 90-degree corner either. You can see that this is not at 90 degrees right here. This is a bit higher than that. We could actually measure it if we wanted to. Why don't we do that? So in ZBrush, let's just rotate this. Just for the sake of it, let me just rotate this until the bottom here is completely straight. And so what is the angle here? So we have about 25 degrees or so, right? So this angle is about 110 to 120 degrees. If we could spot the exact back line here for the mandible, this whole angle here would be about 120 degrees or so. Now, this is actually an angle that changes significantly through age. This actually changes quite a lot, actually. So as people age, what happens is that the angle of the jaw actually changes. There are bony differences between older individuals and younger ones that people don't necessarily know too much about. Like we think that the aging process is something that applies to the fat mostly of the face, and we certainly know that the skin certainly loses elasticity with age, but we don't necessarily always think about the fact that aging also has an impact on the skull itself. Like the skull will change. Certain parts of the skull will have a tendency to recede, so they will, or resorb, they will become less prominent, and other parts of the skull will actually become more prominent as we age. So there are certainly differences there in terms of age between younger individuals and older individuals. And what happens is that with age, the body will simply continue to develop certain little bumps, especially on the forehead, actually. Let's go through a few of these different images together and really look at like aging differences between younger individuals and older individuals. A lot softer and rounder here. So let's talk about the aging process a little bit. What happens as people age? The bone structure of the face will undergo changes as people age. I'll just enumerate those right now, and then we'll go through and we'll talk about each point individually. The changes that happen to the bone structure as we age. First, there is what we call a resorption. So the maxilla, especially the maxilla, which is the teal portion right here, the maxilla will have a tendency to shrink a little bit. It will become a bit smaller with age. Other changes, the mandible will have a tendency as we age. The mandible will have a tendency to simply become shorter as well. So the distance between the teeth here and the bottom part here of the mandible, this whole zone here will simply also resorb. So this will become shorter as we age, which give people the appearance of having a jaw that's simply like a smaller jaw. But inversely, the parts of the face that are bumpy, like the bumps of the face. So what kind of bumps we have the superciliary arches right here. We have the mental trigone. We have the corner here of the mandible. All of these little bumps, they actually undergo the inverse change. They have a tendency to grow a bit more with time. So as we age, these different bumps of the face have a tendency to simply become more prominent. Some things become bigger. Other things will have a tendency to resorb or becomes smaller with age. And collectively, all of these things really change the appearance of the face as we get older there. Let's go through a few different pictures. So this is more or less the aging process. So this is younger. And this is older. This is from a reference I'll give you guys. I'm not sure. I guess I'll post the actual links as a link on the page where you will find the video for this particular class. I guess I'll just put the links on there directly. But yeah, so as we get older, then the bone, like, we will see a resorption of the maxilla. You guys can see here, like, this is the maxilla right here, right? And check like the spacing, like check how wide this is where the teeth are in relation to a younger face that simply has a much broader set of teeth there. So the teeth has a tendency to resorb, to become smaller with age. And you can also appreciate just how thin this is becoming right here compared to this. So as far as the mental trigone is concerned, we don't have much here to begin with, so I guess that probably won't develop itself too much with age there, but we certainly seem to have, it's kind of hard to say because the lighting doesn't conduce itself too well to this, but this seems quite large to me. Like we're also getting like a very significant bump here on the sides there. So there are changes like these that certainly happen. These are the same skulls, but from side view. These references are really beautiful, by the way. And yeah, check. So we said that the mental trigone wasn't really developing itself too much, but actually take a look at it from profile. This is huge. This is absolutely incredibly huge, yeah. And the fact that the body of the mandible becomes shorter with age makes the angle of the mandible, so this angle here that we defined before at somewhat of about 110 degrees or so, I think that was about the number that we had. This angle here will then certainly naturally change as well, you know? And so for a younger face, the angle here will be, you know, 90 degrees, maybe 95 to like 105, 110 degrees or so. And as we age, this value will simply increase to the order of like 110 to like 130 degrees or so. So the angle of the mandible changes in value as we age. And we can see like how overly developed the mental trigone is just becoming right here. This is absolutely enormously huge. And as we saw in the previous picture, the maxilla was also much smaller, right? And all of these things combined, like each of these things combined, let's go through this one first, right? You can see how prominent the superciliary arches are here. So we get like a very prominent mental trigone, and we get a very prominent superciliary arch right there. So all of this combines to give faces this kind of look as we get older there, right? It's like, so I mean, there are obviously changes to the face beyond that. It's not just the only thing that happens. You know, there are changes as far as the fat pads are concerned. There are changes as far as skin is concerned. There's a whole lot of stuff there. But what is very common, right? Like when we think of like an older individual and we think in terms of face, we think of like the mouth being like, you know, sort of just sucked in a little bit, like smaller teeth, you know, and just like this kind of wider jaw, or like this kind of wider sort of like wide but very short, you know, like very short but wide sort of jaw there. Because of all the changes that kind of happen in this particular zone, you know, and this becomes a lot shorter. And then, you know, because like everything and the maxilla and the teeth kind of recede back inward a little bit, you start to get a lot more wrinkling of the skin that kind of happens here. Now, of course, as I said, there are certainly changes to the skin, to the fat pads, these sorts of things. It's not just that, but this is a major contributor to like older people you just got a feeling that like the teeth, like everything is kind of getting sucked in a little bit within the face there. This is Dame Judi Dench. Now that I'm looking at her, I'm not sure I really should have her here because, well, she's rich, so she probably can't afford to have quite a lot of fillers and inserts. I mean, I don't know that she has these things, but it is possible. Therefore, maybe this is a bit misleading. But why I actually like this, because what I wanted to say too is that the maxilla resorbs, right? It goes further inward as we age, but it's not the only changes that happen. There is in the midface. We'll come back on that more in 2 weeks' time. But in the midface, we actually, especially for females, through the aging process, we have a tendency to get more fat in the cheeks. So the cheeks actually become more prominent. Like you get more fat in the midface, usually as a female, as you get older there, which like these things kind of all help, you know, like you have a resorption a little bit of the maxilla, but you also get more fat getting deposited in the cheeks. And so you get that kind of interplay where the mouth kind of pushes inward and the cheeks kind of push outward a little bit. You know, which is also clearly visible here a little bit, you know, like just look at how big all of this here is. And looking at a male face, Marlon Brando. Yeah, just look at how incredibly wide this is right here, or how deep that is perhaps, or just how high. I guess high would be the proper word. Just how high this whole thing here is, right? And when he was a lot older there, you can see that there's been a shortening. You can see how a lot deeper, you know, there seems to be this kind of separation here between the mental trigone on the bottom. On a younger version of him, like there's practically no separation here. Like that line would still be there if the lighting was good for it. But clearly we can see that like the lighting is very, very consistent here. There doesn't seem to be a lot of variation. You know, you will commonly see this for like younger people. This will look very, very flat, you know, or somewhat flat. Like there won't necessarily seem to be a lot of volume change between the chin and the mouth there, because of how wide all of the teeth is and how undeveloped, I suppose, is the chin there. And as you age, that relationship completely changes. And finally, everyone's favorite wizard, Ian McKellen, and who better to end this class than this guy? And the same thing, more or less, applies. Can see how deeper this whole separation is. Like here, it's practically not even visible. It's like you practically don't even really see it, right? And this is a lot broader. Yeah, I guess we could maybe take a look at these scans once more to see if there's anything else in there, because there are some interesting older individuals in here as well. You know, we could even just compare the chin, really, right? Let's look at females. Yeah. See this here, see how prominent this is? It sticks out so far out. These are all relatively younger. All right. That is it. This is our first, first anatomy class. This is our first in-depth class as far as anatomy is concerned. So this was the skull. What we have next week will be a in-depth analysis, as much as this was, on all the facial muscles. It's impossible to talk about muscles without also talking about facial expressions a little bit there. So it's going to be a bit of a combo between these two different topics. And in 2 weeks' time, the class will be on facial fat pads, which I'm very, very, very much looking forward to. But yeah, so that's kind of it, guys. Let's have our last Q&A.
All right, so I'm not with a question. I'm again this time with my usual asking for feedback of the model that I have. Like I already did my Matthew McConaughey. I even went to secondary shapes. So if you want to, I can send it again, and we can.
Yeah, send to me.
Sweet. Let me just go here. Okay, so yeah, as I said, I've already went into doing secondary shapes. What I tried to do is nail the area of the eyes of the corner, like the corners, trying to do the eyebrows properly, which kind of, yeah, I kind of didn't do the job yet, but overall for the head, I think it's kind of going in the right direction. Still, the mouth needs some proper adjustments. I can't say that it's a proper likeness of Matthew McConaughey. It's more of just a regular head, but with more time, I hope that it will get into looking much more to Matthew McConaughey. Like the neck still has more work to do. I had some hard time doing it. Probably you can assist me with orientating me how to do it. And around the jaw, I was wondering how I could do the jaw, because I was trying to carve it to nail it down, because most of the references I couldn't really see how his jaw looks like. And overall, yeah, you can just have a look at the head and say what you think is wrong or right.
Yeah. So, okay. I believe we've looked at this head before, and I have to say that you have improved it quite a lot since then, but there is more work to do. One thing that kind of sticks out. So I'm going to point out things in no particular order. They're just things that cross through my mind and that I think are worthwhile to say here. Let's see here. So, okay. First, looking at the cheekbones, there's a lot of men especially have cheekbones that are very, very high, or at least they seem high. I mean, they're pretty much in the same position, but they seem a lot higher because they have a lot less mid-face fat. So if I'm looking at the cheekbones, what I'm looking for is an angle change, right? That's like always what I'm kind of hunting for in this particular case. And what I'm hunting for is this particular line here. So the line that separates the flatter part here, the kind of flat plane that you have here from the side there. And what I want is to be looking for, where does that line fall? Like, where is it, right? And if I compare your model with that, your line is simply a lot lower, like it should be higher. Like, yeah, you can see the line here very clearly. And what I'm doing, I'm more or less just in my mind trying to compare, let's say, the opening of the eye here in relation to this line here. So this here is like, I don't know, maybe it's about double, maybe it's a bit less than that, like the width here. If we were to draw a straight line straight across from here to there, this is about like a bit less than double what this line here is. And I'm kind of comparing with your 3D model here. So going from here all the way down to, like, I would place the line about here. This is kind of where I can kind of see it there. Like this distance here is a lot larger what you have than what this is here, right? So you need to bring the whole cheekbones higher. You need to make this just a lot further up like that. Maybe move him outward a bit more, but you definitely need to make this plane change a lot higher. Okay, the shape of the skull. I guess you don't have images of Matthew McConaughey without hair in there, so it's a bit hard. Maybe you could use, you could get yourself like references of someone who has no hair on their skull, so, and you can kind of Frankenstein these two references together there. I'm kind of looking at the temporal plane that you got here. And I would really like to see a bit, just a bit more definition on the temporalis, on the muscular part of it. You know, like just a bit more volume like this a little bit. And just soften this particular line here. I think this line's a bit too strong. Now from this angle, now I don't think he necessarily has a lot of temporal muscle that's kind of showing. This is very, very flat. But there's more softness in how these different plane changes connect and what you have, I think. And it's really worth to just maybe go in here and just soften this transition down a little bit. You know, like you're not actually breaking the relationship between the planes. Like the planes are still there. It's just that the transition between the planes is a lot rounder and it's a lot softer. So this already helps for me to read the zone a bit more. About the neck and the jaw, maybe looking a little too wide. This one's not too bad. Oh yeah, this one here. I guess this was more or less around the same time. Like he's also one of those that like changes his weight drastically, right, between rows. You know, like he was in what was that movie again that was playing like a gay guy in the AIDS epidemic? I don't remember the name of that movie.
That hotel, yeah, I haven't watched it yet, but I think I know where he was really, really lean.
Yeah, like he changes like his weight a lot. Ooh, this one's pretty good. Yeah, like his weight changes a lot. It's one of those actors that like to do that. But yeah, so I feel that his neck is just overall a lot thinner. Like so for the neck itself, like you want to keep this line be very, very straight. Like as you go down, I know why you did this here. This is like one of the branches of sternocleido mastoid, but I would propose that you keep it going straight down. Since you already have a separation here, you know, you get this kind of triangle here because you have the sternal part that goes and connects down to the sternum. So the part that is the clavicular part really more or less just goes straight down to the bone. So I would keep this straighter here, and by consequence, this will already help to make his neck look a lot more narrow. But I think I would argue that this needs to go even further than that. Somewhere around here, and it's worth to look at it from every angle, see what it looks like. The thing too about sternocleidomastoid is that it's a lot more vertical than people usually think it is. You know, we have a tendency to make it look at a bit of an angle like that, and you know there are certain people that do have it like that, but like almost, or like in general, essentially, you would actually expect this to be a bit more like this or so, a bit like that. Like sternocleidomastoid has a tendency to be very, very straight down. We can go through these references and kind of look at that. So here, see how straight down it goes, you know? There's a very slight slant forward, but it's really, really small. Like this is almost a vertical line. So the pit here of the neck recedes really far back. It really recedes back. Like you get this kind of really interesting, like we only have busts here, but if you were to look at someone's profile, like this is something you can find a bunch of references and just observe for yourself after the class is done. There's this really nice angle break that happens between this angle that is receding backwards for the neck, and then once you hit the clavicles, you kind of have a more or less symmetrical line that projects forward, just like this here. So you get this back and this forward, you know, and that's really, really cool if you can capture that. So in your case here, yeah, I would bring the neck further back. I think this is pretty good. Just like that, it's fine. Although there still is a lot of mass here. I think overall this is just too high, actually. Yeah, like I guess this is where it's kind of hurting, where it's starting to hurt that all your references he's wearing clothes, because you can't really appreciate well enough what is happening with the neck there, you know, which is fine. You can just get yourself a bunch of other references of someone else who has a similar morphology and just more or less mix all these together. But you know, like the bottom of the neck is often more narrow than the top part. Like this is often wider than it is here, you know? And we have a tendency to kind of sculpt it inversely, you know, we have a tendency to make the bottom of the neck wider than the top part, if you will. But the relationship is actually inverted. Like, let's go through a few of these different references to see that, you know? See how thin this actually is, you know, like in relation to that? Like, in this case here, it's more or less the same length, or the same depth, I guess. But here you can see this is more narrow than what we have here. Now, of course, you know, there's fat here and stuff that contributes to that as well. But more or less, it's more or less true across the population, as you can see. He's got a lot of mass here, so it's like his trapezius are starting to run almost up to the chin there. But in most cases, this is usually a bit further down there. You know, so yeah, so I would actually thin out the side of the neck there. You know, I would just go in here and I would just start to kill a lot of this heaviness that's kind of building up here. And then I would also look to maybe even bring this even further back. And like, there certainly is expansion for the neck. It's just that it happens a bit further down usually. Something like that or so. So this fixes this. Yeah, we've done a few key changes here. We've done some changes here. We've filled this up here a little bit. There's still something about the jaw that I'm not quite sure about. I think it, no, we do see the masseter. You do have a bit of that, but it still feels like there's something about this.
Yeah, maybe the buccal fat. I think if we look at the references, he kind of lacks some buccal fats, and the more I look at the references, it's always changed. Either it's more prominent, or the lighting is really flat, and you can't tell if there's a depression or not.
Yeah. That's why, like, this is a great reference right here, right? Like, you can see the separation between the masseter in the back and the modulus in the front, and you can really appreciate like how little buccal fat he's really got there. Yeah, like you can kind of see the buccal fat here a little bit that you sculpted there. Yeah, so I would definitely just make this even further inward. Really, just remove that completely. Yeah, I mean, I would start with all these, and I think it's going to bring you a lot closer to the face there.
Yes, and you talked about the fat around the orbital area around the eyes. I was hesitating, figuring out how much fat he had around the eyebrow, and figuring out how much of a concavity he needs to have. And almost like for now, it kind of looks like he has much more concavity on the 3D model, more instead of the reference that we're looking at right now. I'm not sure what to think about the eye, how much fat he has around there.
Yeah, I mean, this is receding further back, but take a look at the brow ridge here, how thick this is and how thin the upper lid is, right? Like, you like always want to be looking for like relationship between sizes and proportions, right? And like, if I'm comparing how small here we can see the lid compared to how much we see of the brow ridge, like, you don't have that relationship here at all. So yeah, you definitely have to fill this up here, you know, add a bunch of fat here and like stuff. But yeah, let's talk more about the fat once we get to that point in about 2 weeks' time. But yeah, I think this should get you well on your way. Once you've addressed these things, I think the key will really start to be to really improve those secondary shapes there.
Yeah. Oh, and when I was looking at, I think the glabella, this glabella looks really flat. The center part kind of looks really flat, like in comparison with other skulls. I'm not sure if I'm the only one seeing, but it feels like there's just this big flat on his glabella parts, and it's kind of, or there's just this there's some kind of a depression
There's a depression for sure, yeah. Yeah, you can clearly see it here. Yeah. All right. Let me look at other questions that we have. Quick says, in regards to the nasal aperture, do the nostrils at its widest point usually stay within that opening, or can they extend past that? I guess you mean on the outside, Quicks? They certainly extend past that, yeah. They're like a shape that really kind of pushes outward, right? So the whole wings of the nostril, they're just made of fat, really, like this whole thing is fat, and it certainly does often create this kind of shape like that. Now, again, this will vary from like person to person, but you can definitely push this outward just a little bit. It's an interesting question to ponder. All right. With those with microphones, do we have any more questions? So I have a few minutes here that we can spend. I guess that's it. I guess that's it, everyone. And yeah, I hope that this was interesting, that you have learned something. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week while we will talk about facial muscles.